a disease that affects over 300,000 Canadians. And whereas Ashley Hanna was diagnosed with epilepsy when she was just 5 years old, and whereas Ashley is on a mission to educate everyone in her school about epilepsy, and on the March 26th, which is National Purple Day for Epilepsies in Canada, and everybody at her school wore purple on that day. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate and thank Ashley Hanna, her principal Jeannie Stone, and all the staff and all the students from Mountain View Elementary for making everyone aware of this Purple Day. And Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 12:02. We will finish at 1:02. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past 3 years, the Premier has lost credibility when it comes to financial management, Mr. Speaker. We know that his budget last year overstated revenue by $27 million. This was more than an error, Mr. Speaker. It was a conscious effort to make the numbers match the storyline instead, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the management of the province's finances, the Premier has shown time and time again, Mr. Speaker, fiction after fiction. So why should Nova Scotians accept anything different next week?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what this government has demonstrated is some of the best financial management practices that the government of Nova Scotia has ever seen. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we have changed past practices to reflect greater transparency. We have done more in the way of multi-year budgeting. We have set targets and met them. We have ensured that the expenditures made by our departments consistently come in under budget, Mr. Speaker. That is the record of this government. It is a good one, and we are proud of it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, he forgot to add that he added $1.4 billion to the debt of the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this comes down to an issue of trust, Mr. Speaker. This is the Premier who hiked 1,400 user fees late on a Friday afternoon, Mr. Speaker, and today he hiked those fees once again, even with a greater number, Mr. Speaker. He hiked the HST after specifically saying he wouldn't, shifted 2 university payments in 1 year, tore up the MOU with municipalities without notice, and failed to disclose a $27 million overstated in revenues in last year's budget, Mr. Speaker. If Nova Scotians could not believe last year's numbers, why should they believe next week's anymore?
The Honourable the Premier.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I understand that when it comes to the performance of the province and when it comes to the fact that we have a group of very hard-working people here who are trying to make sure that we balance the challenges that governments face along with the opportunities that are out there, that is not something that the Leader of the Opposition and the party that he represents want to encourage. But the reality is this is this is the job that we have. We are supplying the services of that the people of this province require, because this government is about the people. This is about ensuring that they get what they need in order to be able to live lives of dignity, in order to be able to make sure that young people are able to get a job when they need one, to make sure that the children who go to our schools get the education that they need. That is the job of the government of Nova Scotia. We're doing it, and we're doing it within the financial ability that the province has.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the job of a government, and indeed any Nova Scotian, is to be open and honest and truthful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when you know and when you knew there was a mistake in last year's budget, and yet you stood in this House and allowed that myth to continue for a year, and only pointed out by the Auditor General, Mr. Speaker, it speaks to the arrogance and credibility of this government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there isn't a single employer in the province of Nova Scotia who wouldn't fire an employee who misled them, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the Premier: did he fire the former finance minister, or did the former finance minister quit after tabling a budget he knew had a $27 million error?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, try as they might like, simple fact of the matter is that the Leader of the Opposition misstates this completely. The former Minister of Finance followed the procedure that, in fact, Liberal governments would have followed in the past, which is they choose a date on which economic data is fixed, and it goes into the budget the way it should. The Auditor General was advised of the incoming economic data. He was advised that it would be added in the first financial forecast. He accepted that. In fact, Mr. Speaker, he did a letter which was included with the budget debate that specifically said that he agreed with the forecast, the revenue forecast for the province. That, of course, is the way that it should be done. He also put forward in his last report a number of recommendations with respect to transparency. And as I've already pointed out, this is a government that is leading the way in Canada in transparency. And we're going to adopt those recommendations and make the financial reporting of our province even stronger.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Yesterday, the minister in question period revealed very personal information about an apparent client of her department, and I tabled that information earlier. I've already cited a number of precedents and how it's virtually automatic that a minister resign under those circumstances. So my question to the minister is, will she resign immediately and apologize to the persons that she hurt with her breach of confidentiality?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, my answer is no.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
I guess there's not even an apology coming here. Mr. Speaker, it's not surprising that the minister fails to understand the consequences of her action or how serious they are. The minister is responsible for hundreds of case files for very vulnerable people who must be able to trust her to keep their personal information confidential. But last year, when we called for her resignation over her handling of the Talbot file and her department's public and personal dismissal of the respected executive director, of course she refused at that time, but shortly after the Premier took away her responsibility for that file and addiction services. When the minister was caught in multiple flip-flops about the fate of private daycares, and earlier this week in the speech from the throne, it appears the Premier took that responsibility away from her too. So I will ask the Premier, will he remove the minister from Cabinet for this shocking breach of confidentiality, and will he merely take away her responsibility for all her client files one by one until she has none left?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday in the House I reviewed the information that was provided by the minister, and I have to say I've often thought that the questions that get asked are, they're difficult ones for any minister. It's particularly difficult for ministers with portfolios like the Department of Community Services. I found the answer that the minister gave in relation to that file to be compassionate, to be understanding, to try to address what is a very serious issue, and she did so. I think that was entirely appropriate.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, this Premier excuses every incompetence with his government. With every breach, he stands by a budget cover-up of $27 million, which his Treasury Board deliberately overlooked, but the Auditor General did not. He kept his minister around with demoted responsibilities in spite of a string of issues that shows that she's not up to the job. And he himself thinks it's okay for a Premier not to know what is happening with his own government. But he is the Premier who ducks responsibility or leadership at every turn. Will the Premier finally do something and remove a minister who would divulge personal information in clear contravention of law, practice, and decency?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, nothing really could be further from the truth. What the minister said was perfectly appropriate. It is certainly within the rules and has no bearing on the release of information, all of which was already in the public domain. Mr. Speaker, it is simply the case that the minister takes each of her files very seriously. And I think, like all of us, would wish nothing but the best, particularly for those people who are vulnerable, who come out to us with issues, with problems. And the minister, I think, forthrightly says that when these kinds of issues come forward, that she is demonstrating great leadership in trying to deal with the issues head on. And you know, in my view, Mr. Speaker, she should be congratulated for that work and not chastised as the member for Argyll would have us believe.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Energy. Mr. Speaker, the NDP have claimed again yesterday that the Muskrat Falls project is the cheapest solution for energy for Nova Scotians. Yet they have not proved that, and if they have the proof, they're hiding the information from Nova Scotians. Even Emera says, and I'll quote Emera's document, a final decision on how customers will pay for this new source of electricity and over what period of time will actually be determined as part of the general rate application process before the UARB in 2017. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that the minister seems to know what the rate will be because he's obviously telling everyone it will be the cheapest option, but even the proponent of the project says they don't know. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Energy tell us what the rate for Muskrat Falls Energy will be when it is landed in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly the Maritime Link provides many opportunities for Nova Scotians to provide the lowest, fairest rates for electricity in this province. It provides stable prices for 35 years. I would suggest the honourable member might want to read the Dalton report that will give the assumptions and the details on why this is the best deal for ratepayers in this province.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Dalton's report has been widely discredited by many of the experts in the field who have said that it actually misrepresented a lot of the numbers. He actually made claims about organizations that the organizations themselves said were inaccurate. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what the NDP did with the recent call for proposals on renewable energy. You know, they set up a process whereby they set up a process whereby Nova Scotia Power could undercut independent renewable energy suppliers and download the cost to ratepayers. And so you look at the South Canoe project as an example, it moves ahead with uncertain costs when in fact Dalton, who the minister in fact referenced, said that he told the department that there were risks associated with the way that would be done. So, Mr. Speaker, once again, the NDP chose higher profits for Nova Scotia Power and Emera so that they could spend that money outside of Nova Scotia over jobs and economic opportunities in green energy in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, why did the minister allow the IPP process to be rigged so that Nova Scotia Power could download their capital cost to ratepayers while driving away new renewable energy investment that would have created new rural jobs in Nova Scotia and cheaper energy prices out in this province?
I can't. I have a little problem hearing today for a sec there. Did you say the word rigged? Yeah.
I can withdraw that.
I think that word is unparliamentary.
I'll withdraw that word.
Shane, and
I have to withdraw that word.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly you've referenced Mr. Dalton of Power Advisory Inc., a well-respected energy expert in the North American market. In fact, he's done work for this province since about the year 2000 under various governments. He's done work in New Brunswick and Vermont and various other jurisdictions in eastern North America. So, and he lives by his reputation. He has to defend his reports before public utilities like the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board, and he has to have credible evidence. All the evidence will be cross-referenced by other interveners to, and that's how he stays in business. He lives on his reputation. So I take umbrance with the honourable member's information on Mr. Dalton, but in reality, we have a plan for energy in this province. Certainly, the Muskrat Falls is part of that. But we've taken the HST off of home energy. We've introduced Efficiency Nova Scotia to provide relief for low income and really for all Nova Scotians. And we have a plan to have the lowest, fairest electricity rates in this province.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Dalton was asked about this on February 27th, and he said, and I'll table this from the Herald, Mr. Dalton said Tuesday he does agree that allowing the utility to charge its capital costs back to ratepayers gives the project a different risk profile than the other projects had. So the minister is wrong. Mr. Dalton actually said that he advised the... Mr. Speaker, at the same time, this minister can't tell us the price of this energy. His department was presented with a proposal which he decided to turn down from a renewable energy in Cape Breton that offered a guaranteed rate for longer than 35 years at a cost cheaper than Muskrat Falls, that offered almost all of its economic opportunities in Nova Scotia instead of most of them in Newfoundland, offered a lower carbon footprint than Muskrat Falls, and delivered jobs in Cape Breton. This minister and this premier said no. I will table, Mr. Speaker, I will table the comparative cost analysis by Cape Breton Explorations for their project, which the minister already has, of course. So, Mr. Speaker, why did the minister refuse to allow a renewable energy project that offered to deliver fixed prices, good jobs in Nova Scotia, and new green investment in Nova Scotia, and instead choose to only support a project that costs ratepayers more than that one and helps make Nova Scotia Power even more money?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And our goal here is to bring the lowest, fairest electricity rates for Nova Scotians, and I have to ask, the honourable member, what's the cost of the Liberal plan? I haven't seen that yet either. So all I see is talk about Hydro-Quebec, and more Hydro-Quebec. So when are you going to start standing up for Nova Scotians?
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, let me read a comment from Hansard, October 5, 2009, about prepaying universities and fiscal shell games. Quote, "Well, I have a view of why they did that. They did that in order to make this year's books look as good as possible, knowing that they were on the eve of an election," unquote. And the members of the House might be wondering who said that, and I'm sure the minister is wondering who said that. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was the current member for Fairview, Halifax Fairview, who was the finance minister at the time. He made these comments when he was while he was continuing the very same practices that he was disparaging, while he was doing a prepayment to universities. That is what the NDP government does, business, how they do business, saying one thing and doing another. Mr. Speaker, after proving that the NDP is more than willing to say one thing and do another, and after having shown that in past budgets the NDP has been comfortable with playing financial shell games, the question for the minister is, how can Nova Scotians be certain that this finance minister has not pulled yet another prepayment in order to make this year's books look as good as possible, knowing that they are also on the eve of an election?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, universities are a really important feature of Nova Scotia's economy and our learning environment. We're very lucky to have the strong university sector in our province, and if universities are in a situation where they require support from this government on an annual basis, we work very hard to accommodate what those needs are. And whether or not there's a prepayment in any year, it means that the next year it might also be prepaid, but Mr. Speaker, it doesn't make any difference, really. It means that the money is properly accounted for, the payments go to where they're needed, and this gives us the strong university sector that we enjoy in the province, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in their first budget back in 2009, the NDP pulled the same sleight of hand that the former government had tried to pull. That was with prepaying universities in one year and not the next, in manipulating what the budget would actually show. When the previous government front-loaded their budget prior to the 2009 election, the NDP cried foul, and in fact the Premier called it a fudget budget. If this is the legacy, which is now the NDP's record, shifting around payments, hiking fees, failing to disclose significant financial information, and this finance minister has given Nova Scotians no reason to trust her today. Mr. Speaker, will the minister tell Nova Scotians if there has been any prepayment to universities in this fiscal year that will alter the true budget that we'll be seeing next week?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, all of the details of the budget will be available for the honourable member and the public on Budget Day.
The honourable member for the honourable leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Somebody. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, yesterday in public accounts and again in this House, we learned that the Treasury Board decided to ignore a known error of $27 million in the budget that was presented to all Nova Scotians. That makes the decision to ignore that error a political one and not an accounting one, Mr. Speaker. When the Treasury Board decided to ignore that known error and allow an error-prone budget to be presented, they took the integrity of this government into their own hands. Either that, Mr. Speaker, or they went right to the top. My question to the Premier is, when did the Premier know, on what date did he know that his budget was wrong?
Good question. Yeah.
The budget was never wrong and there was never an error made. The information went directly to the Auditor General. He was fully aware of it. He wrote a letter stating that the revenue projections were correct, Mr. Speaker. So that is the case. As to his complaint around the $27 million, I would have known that when he issued the further report that came out, a couple of weeks ago in February, because Mr. Speaker, as the Auditor General pointed out, it was not material. It was, in fact, Mr. Speaker, the normal practice for governments right up until he complained about this particular instance, the same practice that the Conservative government would have used for years, Mr. Speaker. In fact, what he did was make a recommendation with respect to greater transparency, one that, had the previous government changed, this would never have been an issue, but they didn't. So, Mr. Speaker, we're going to adopt the recommendation because it's the appropriate thing to do. And, Mr. Speaker, I believe that this will create a level of transparency and integrity in our books that is appropriate.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General was very clear that this is a significant error. It is a $27 million error. $27 million is a lot of money to every Nova Scotian, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday at Public Accounts, the Auditor General said that the issue of materiality is irrelevant to whether you fix an error or not. If the budget is wrong and you know it, you fix it. That is a principle that all Nova Scotians will understand. But the Treasury Board, knowing that the budget was wrong, chose not to fix it. And when they made that decision, they took the integrity of this Premier's government into their own hands. So I will ask the Premier whether any of his staff were present at that Treasury Board decision. And I hope he answers it, Mr. Speaker, because we are going to do a Freedom of Information request and find out if they were there or not. But he can save the paperwork and clear this up right now and tell us whether his office was present when that awful decision was made.
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we'll deal with the Freedom of Information request when it comes, but I can tell him this. What came to Treasury Board, I went back and checked on this, was not a decision. In fact, they weren't asked for a decision at all because there was no decision to be made. That was made by the Department of Finance. The only thing that came to the Treasury Board is the revenue information for information, not for decision.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, no one elected the Department of Finance. They elected that Premier and that government to tell them the truth when they present budgets to the people of Nova Scotia. So the Premier might want to talk to his own Deputy Minister of Finance, who in public accounts yesterday said that the department sent the information to Treasury Board, and when she was asked who made the decision, she didn't say they did, she said Treasury Board made the decision, Mr. Speaker. That is a matter of record in public accounts. So I will ask the Premier, if he is so callous about the integrity of his own government, why does he sit idly by while it is under such serious question?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the question that the leader asked is simply factually incorrect. It says things that people said in other things that are untrue, Mr. Speaker. The budget is prepared by the Department of Finance. It is prepared by the Department of Finance. It's based on the budget revenue estimates. And remember, they're forecasts that are done on March 1st. And everything else that comes after that, at that time, as was the practice with 10 years of Conservative government, is included in the first forecast update. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the appropriate thing to do, and that is exactly what was done.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister for Community Services please tell members of this House how many families are waiting for affordable housing in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member opposite with respect to wait lists, the fact is that the wait lists themselves have different meaning, because we have people on the wait list that may want to move to specific affordable housing, and they have to wait for that particular house or apartment to become available because it's something that they want. But I also can say that we are the first government in the history of Nova Scotia that is going to do something about it, because we are going forward with the first in Nova Scotia housing strategy.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
To answer my question, Mr. Speaker, according to eligibility stats provided by the Department of Community Services, there are 1,777 families waiting for housing, and that's 591 in HRM alone. Can the Minister please tell members of this House how many seniors are waiting for housing in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, what I would like to say about housing in the province is it takes time in order to build the infrastructure throughout the province of Nova Scotia. And it's too bad when the Liberals were in 10 years ago, they didn't plant the seeds to go towards that, to be able to build housing. The same with the Progressive Conservatives. We wouldn't be having this type of issue in the province if they would have done some planning. And we are doing something. We have come forward with announcing, and we'll be doing a housing strategy that is going to help seniors. It's going to be able to help those who are most vulnerable. And so at least, you know what? We do something. We do not just say words without action. Our words always come with action.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the Minister's information, there are 2,518 seniors across the province waiting for affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, the department has information outlining need for affordable housing, yet this government has waited for the final hours of a majority mandate to even begin consultation. It would seem this is not the same NDP that touted social justice when they were in opposition. My question, why is it taking so long? Could it be that this NDP cares more about polling numbers than the numbers of families and seniors in need of housing?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have worked from day one becoming government for seniors, for the most vulnerable in this province. We have invested over $420 million throughout all our departments. We have been strategizing. We have been consulting. It is not a last minute. They may make decisions on the last minute for political reasons. We have worked very hard. I traveled last fall throughout this whole province. We received well over 500 pieces of correspondence and emails. We have the stakeholders in this province supporting what we're doing. They have been involved with this process from day one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier says he didn't know about the $27 million error in the budget. That leaves that awful decision squarely on the shoulders of the President of the Treasury Board, where the Deputy Minister of Finance said at Public Accounts yesterday the decision was actually made. The decision to present a budget with known errors to the people of Nova Scotia apparently was made at Treasury Board, chaired by the President of the Treasury Board, the Deputy Premier. So my question to the Deputy Premier, Mr. Speaker, is who in the Premier's office got minutes of, was told about, was informed about the decision to go forward with a budget that they knew was wrong before it went to the printers?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell the Leader of the Third Party once again that it was presented to Treasury Board as an item of information.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
It's good to know, Mr. Speaker, because if it was presented as an item of information that there was a $27 million mistake and then the Treasury Board had to deal with it, we're finally getting somewhere. Now, Mr. Speaker, either the chair of the Treasury Board took the integrity of the entire government in his own hands when they made the decision to go ahead anyway and not tell anyone, or he didn't. And so I will ask the chair of the Treasury Board, the Deputy Premier, did he tell the Premier that he had just approved a budget with a $27 million mistake in it?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the only mistake here is in the line of questioning from that member, Mr. Speaker. We told him again how this was presented to us, and we acted accordingly to what the Auditor General wanted us and told us to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, no one is going to accept that the Auditor General told them or wanted them to leave the mistake uncorrected and not tell anybody about it when they presented it on Budget Day. That goes against every principle of transparency and fair reporting, and quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, it goes against every principle of good governance, where if you make a mistake, you tell people. If you have time to fix it, you fix it. You don't say $27 million is not very much money in a province where $27 million to every single person who relies on a truthful government is a lot of money, Mr. Speaker. So I will ask the Deputy Premier, the Chair of the Treasury Board, why did he allow an error-prone budget to go before the people of Nova Scotia uncorrected?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, and thank you. The only errors, again, are in the line of questioning. Mr. Speaker, we reported it in the first financial update. I don't know what more I can say to that member to get it through to him. That's what we did, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, paramedics sent an alarm bell to the Minister of Health and all Nova Scotians about the exodus of advanced care paramedics to other jurisdictions. In response, the Minister stated, and I quote, "There's paramedics that leave every year in the province, and there's new ones that are hired. It's just like any other profession." Well, Mr. Speaker, in talking to paramedics in my community, they're telling us that it's moving from a trickle to a stream. And in fact, they found the minister's statement uncaring in such an important part of the emergency health services here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, could the minister please tell all the members of the House how an ambulance service will be able to retain its world-class stature if we are losing our most advanced and experienced paramedics to other jurisdictions?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. Anytime I have an opportunity to talk about our highly trained paramedics in this province, I stand by what I said earlier, Mr. Speaker. There are paramedics on a yearly basis that choose to leave the profession here in Nova Scotia. It's very challenging when we see organizations from other jurisdictions like Alberta coming to our province, recruiting our highly trained medics, Mr. Speaker. It's something I've seen through my career as a paramedic. It's something I've seen through my career as a political MLA, Mr. Speaker. We're working extremely hard to create an environment here in Nova Scotia that appreciates paramedics, that gives opportunities for them to stay in the province, especially those medics who have been on the ambulance for a number of years, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud of the work that this government has done to improve the environment, the working environment that our paramedics work in here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm hearing quite a different story from our paramedics from across the province. Many of them expressed their frustration around a lack of recognition for the ever-increasing role we have asked them to play in our healthcare system. Respect in what they are asked to do on a daily basis and the challenges associated with policies they are asked to work within. Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Health, given that the Minister has likely heard some of the concerns expressed as well, could he please indicate whether he has spoke to EMC about these issues, and if so, when?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I was very proud to be part of a government that has increased the awareness of paramedics. I want to congratulate the former minister who had the foresight to see, as we move forward with Better Care Sooner, that a key component of that are our paramedics. They're working in a number of environments that they never worked in before, Mr. Speaker. It's because we recognize the importance of their skills, their training, and their dedication. I know that there are some medics who have chose to leave the province. I don't hold that against any paramedic who makes that decision. It's a very difficult decision to decide maybe to work out west, Mr. Speaker. I know you recognize those decisions that Cape Bretoners have made to choose to go somewhere else to find employment. But I can guarantee, and I want to reassure paramedics, that we highly respect the work they do here in Nova Scotia, that I'm going to continue to work as Minister of Health and on behalf of the government to ensure that they have every opportunity to prosper here in the province, to grow their profession, and to show the respect that they deserve, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And who the minister really needs to give more assurance to are the people of Nova Scotia, because I can assure you there are more ambulances leaving for trauma situations with no advanced care paramedic on board. Mr. Speaker, the strength of our world-class emergency health system lies squarely with our paramedics. We have an emergency health service that Nova Scotians are very proud of. We should be. However, when you are losing your most experienced paramedics, those who can mentor others, when you're losing those who can deliver your clot-busting drugs and those who can work in nursing homes, not to mention those who arrive at the scene of serious accidents for the purpose of immediate treatment and care, you are risking a great deal. My final question to the Minister, how is the Minister going to be able to sustain all of the wonderful things they've mentioned in the throne speech pertaining to emergency services when we are losing some of our most experienced advanced care paramedics?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to reassure not only paramedics but Nova Scotians the importance of ensuring that we have the right number of paramedics across this province. We work every day to ensure that if a paramedic leaves, especially advanced care paramedic, that those positions are filled with advanced care paramedics. By the end of last year, Mr. Speaker, we had over 295 advanced care paramedics in our system. The year before, in 2010, we had 294. So we're roughly keeping the same number of advanced care paramedics in the province. We know the importance of trying to encourage those primary care paramedics, those intermediate care paramedics who are in our system to upgrade their skills so that they can take full advantage of providing the services like clot-busting drugs, Mr. Speaker, a first in North America, if not a first worldwide, here in our province. So we're very proud. I'm very proud of the work we're doing. We're going to continue to work with paramedics to try to address the concerns that some have, and I'm very proud to move forward and work with them and really show the recognition that paramedics deserve, Mr. Speaker, here in our province.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Premier was asked to confirm what the Deputy Minister of Finance said in testimony before the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. She said it was, quote, political masters, the Treasury Board, who decided not to reveal the $27 million budget error. The Deputy Premier, who is also the chair of the Treasury Board, said no. With his answer, a single word, the Deputy Premier undermined the testimony of a long-time respected public servant and Deputy Minister. Will the Deputy Premier retract his statement and confirm it was, in fact, his decision to hide the $27 million error?
Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, this is the same question regurgitated by another member from the same party. Mr. Speaker, I answered it before. It was given to us as information. If they can't understand that, Mr. Speaker, I don't know what else to tell them.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All we're looking for is the truth. The Deputy Premier cannot have it both ways. Either the Deputy Minister is right when she said that the decision to cover up the $27 million budget error was made by the Treasury Board, or she isn't. Nova Scotians deserve straight answers. It's time for him to come clean. Will the Deputy Premier clear up this contradiction between his version of events and that of the Deputy Minister of Finance?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing that has to be cleaned up here is his quotes. Mr. Speaker, that's the reality here, is the quotes that he's making may be inaccurate, Mr. Speaker. So I'd ask him to go and look at Hansard and put forward the proper quotes. Mr. Speaker, we stand by our statements and we support our senior civil servants too, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to this sad affair, all the roads lead to the door of the Deputy Premier's office. The government says that this is all part of their normal budget process. So, Mr. Speaker, if error-prone budgets are normal under the NDP, how can we trust the budget that they're going to deliver to this House next week?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
I guess that falls under, thank you, Mr. Speaker, I guess that falls under what you can't do with fact, you try to do with bluster, and he's not very good at either one, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, since 2008, Strait Area Transit has been providing an essential, accessible transportation for residents of the Strait Area, specifically Richmond County, Inverness County, and the town of Port Hawkesbury. Mr. Speaker, whether it be for medical appointments, to attend Strait Area campus, the community college, or to attend other activities, many residents came to rely on this essential service. Unfortunately, on Monday of this week at 4 p.m., the Board of Strait Area Transit announced that it was going to cease operations effective immediately due to financial problems. My question, Mr. Speaker, is to the Premier. Could the Premier advise what actions his government is prepared to take in order to assist in restoring Strait Area Transit?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know the decision that he's referring to, but if you'd like to send it over to me, I'd be happy to receive it. In fact, when I was last in the Strait, I met with folks from the Strait Area Transit. My understanding is that we assisted them with the issues that they had, the requests that they had. But if there is additional information, I'd be happy to receive it and to have a look at it. In fact, you know, this government sees the question of rural transportation as a very important one. It's becoming increasingly important because of the aging population. Seniors have to be able to get to medical appointments. They have to be able to get to grocery stores. They have to be able to get to pick up prescriptions. And we know this is a growing issue. And in fact, we're in a very proactive fashion trying to address it. Now, can we do everything at once? No, obviously not. But we are mapping out a plan for community transportation which will benefit the people of the province. And in the initial instance, we're working with community-based options.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Premier may have missed it, but I had introduced a resolution earlier talking about Strait Area Transit and its closure and calling upon all members of the House to work together to find a solution. I was very pleased that that received unanimous support of the House because, Mr. Speaker, I did have the opportunity in the fall, as the Premier did indicate, when the Strait Area Transit was faced with financial problems, was to talk to the Deputy Minister of Service Nova Scotia and to the Minister to seek financial assistance, which we're very pleased that they did. Unfortunately, the transit, even with that, has found itself to the point that they were no longer able to operate past Monday of this week, and therefore the operations have ceased. I'm wondering, Mr. Speaker, maybe if the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations could advise us as to what actions his department is prepared to take in working with all partners involved to restore this service immediately.
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, and I also thank him for the answer. It's our desire to meet with the stakeholders there. The department had given Strait Area Transit, I think the member's aware, about $120,000 last fall, another $5,000 I think 2 weeks ago, so I think before we get too far down that road, we want to have a discussion with stakeholders in the area, in particular the municipal units, and to see what is possible to try to ensure the long-term sustainability of that service for the people in the Strait area.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would certainly hope that the Minister would be prepared to have that meeting as soon as possible, because I can tell you my office has been flooded with calls, parents of children who are attending the Rock Centre in Port Hawkesbury, for example, on a daily basis, hearing from students who go to the community college, hearing from people who have regularly scheduled medical appointments, whether it be physio, whether it be dialysis, and they really have no option now as to how they are going to get to and from now that Strait Transit has ceased its operations. In the throne speech, I was pleased to see that the government did acknowledge the importance of community-based transportation. So I guess my question to the Minister is he prepared to commit to meeting with all stakeholders next week so that we can restore the service as soon as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia, Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know what the possibilities around that are. I'm just thinking about the Easter weekend, and we're on thinking about tomorrow and Monday. But I will direct my staff, and I think they've probably been having some discussions already. But I will direct my staff as much as that may be possible to try to see that they could do that. I'd like to participate in that meeting, and I'm not sure if I can, but I'll certainly see that people in my department try to arrange that as soon as possible.
Good, Minister. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you will be to the Minister of Education. Yesterday, after two attempts the minister was unable or unwilling to answer a very simple question: how many school boards will see budget cuts this year? So I trust, Mr. Speaker, that the minister has been briefed on that by now or has read some media coverage. So my question will be, how many school boards will see budget cuts this year?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have 8 school boards in the province of Nova Scotia, and 3 of those school boards will be receiving more funding based on the population that they have within their schools, and 5 school boards will be receiving funding appropriate to the number of students that they have in their system. We were able to make sure that we have guaranteed that our permanent teachers will be able to retain jobs by capping the reductions based on the declining enrollment to most of the school boards to 1.5. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would have been great to have that information yesterday. However, the minister now does know it. Cape Breton Victoria, Chignecto Central, South Shore Regional, Strait Regional, and Tri-County will all see direct funding cuts, courtesy of this minister. So my question to the minister is this: with increasing operating costs and increasing program delivery costs, how are these 5 boards who are receiving less money expected to pay the bills without affecting students in our classroom?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are investing in our students across the province. We have increased the funding per student by 3% this year. We have a problem in our province that we are dealing with that is a nationwide problem with declining enrollment, and we are doing that by investing properly and appropriately in our children in this province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure how comforting those words will be to the parents and students in Tri-County or in South Shore. Both of those boards, Mr. Speaker, courtesy of this minister, have had funding cuts for the last 3 consecutive years. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, courtesy of her NDP government, power rates have been allowed to increase by 30%. In 2012, for example, Mr. Speaker, the power bill for Tri-County was over $1 million. The power bill for South Shore was over $1 million. And both of those are increases, yet funding to those boards have been cut. So my question to the minister, as power rates are increasing, as funding to these boards are decreasing, what programs and services is this minister suggesting should be eliminated so the board can pay their bills?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I trust that the boards will make the appropriate decisions, and no programs from our public school programs will be cut from any of our boards. Our boards are there to make the appropriate decisions, and we are funding them to do that, and if they are having any trouble at all with their budgets, we will send people down to support them. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Education. Education is the key to a confident, bright future for our young Nova Scotians. Rural schools are the heart of our community, supporting the development of our young people. This NDP government is on a destructive path, destroying communities and tearing their hearts out. My question is, Minister, will you step in to ensure that the South Shore Regional School Board doesn't cripple the communities of the schools on the chopping block?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the member opposite for the question. This government is very much invested in our communities and our school communities, and his question is, I find a little perplexing, is that we are supporting all of our schools in the province, and if they're having any significant difficulties with any of the budget considerations, we are most definitely there to support them. I want to say again very clearly, we do support our community schools and our communities and the children that go to those schools. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there's been a 1.5% budget cut to the South Shore Regional School Board this year alone.
which equals $1.8 million, and I have a document here to support that. The local economy has lost 5,600 full-time jobs since February 2009, and I have another document here to support that. In the Chronicle Herald, there was an article that quoted Chairwoman Jennifer Nogler as saying, "I'm very concerned we're driving those communities we thought we were bringing together." The communities want to make this work. My question is, will the NDP commit to stop working against Nova Scotians to start working with them to create a prosperous, bright future?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are working with communities, and we're definitely working with the school board. And our school boards have put their name forward and have been elected to make sure that every student that they have in their district receives the appropriate, equitable, making sure that they are getting everything they need with our public school programs. And they're working hard to do that. And I have met with all of the boards in the province of Nova Scotia over the last couple of weeks, and they know that we are there to work together. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the South Shore Regional School Board is very efficient. They have weathered years of cuts under the current government with no support for positive growth. Rural schools truly are the hearts of our communities. Last May, a group called a Small Schools Delegation met and presented a brief called Schools at the Centre. The group asked to delay reviews in order to address some of their concerns. And we know there was no dice. The response they received, Kelly. Thanks for your unsolicited brief. Will the NDP continue to opt for their preferred recommendations, or will they step up and realize the people are right and their plan is ripping the heart out of communities across this province?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, we are there to work with our school boards to make sure that every student in our province gets the schooling that they need, the proper education. We are investing in our communities, and if any board is having any significant problems, we are there to work together, work with the community to make sure that every child has the opportunity to succeed.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are many disturbing cases of animal abuse in our province. Unfortunately, we've seen little in the way of animal protection during this mandate of the NDP government until recently. My question to the Minister of Agriculture, what tangible and effective changes can the people of Nova Scotia expect from this government in this session?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, that's a good question. It's our plan during this session to introduce legislation that I think will tend to mirror legislation across the country in other provinces to increase penalties in particular. I think clarify some language in the present act, and I want the member to be aware that this would be the second time in our mandate that we made adjustments to that act. So I asked them to hold on. It'll probably be, I think, a week or two before that legislation gets introduced.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
I thank the Minister for that straightforward answer. Mr. Speaker, however, it is a shame the NDP government has not acted upon animal cruelty matters until now. Cases of abuse, puppy mills and terrible breeding and living conditions for animals across the province have occurred while government sat idly by. And Mr. Speaker, many of the changes government can make to address these issues can be made in regulations, not in legislation. Therefore, the NDP did not have to wait for the legislative session to make changes. My question to the Minister, why has the Minister waited to make changes in legislation when the changes could have been made in regulations by the Executive Council at any time?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Yeah, I'd like the member opposite to think for a second around the issue on the broader scope. It's an animal health issue. We rely in particular on the veterinarians who work for us to advise us on legislation or regulations around animal health.
We think that it's important to listen to the people who are professionally trained in this area, and to this point, in my time as minister, which is coming on for 4 years, there's nothing that they brought to us that would indicate that there's anything that regulation would have to be tweaked. But we are doing a review of that legislation. We have some ideas of changes that we think would be significant and would mirror legislation across the country. But I want to make it clear that we really depend on information from professional veterinarians on how to go about legislation or regulation in terms of proper care for animals.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 days ago, we learned that the government plans to create a new department, the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. Mr. Speaker, on a number of occasions, we've asked the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, on a number of occasions, we've asked the Minister of Community Services, who used to be responsible for childcare, to clarify statements you made with regard to funding for childcare centres. And at best, Mr. Speaker, she's been inconsistent. So my question will be for the Minister of Education. Will the Minister tell members of this House what plans her government has for the funding model for childcare centres in Nova Scotia?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to stand here today representing the early years component of the work that this government does. It is very important that every child in this province has the opportunity to reach their potential. So this government is making sure that we're looking at education and child development from zero, from birth, right straight through to their years of schooling. So I'm very proud to be able to say that we will be talking about these initiatives in the coming weeks, and I'm very proud that at this time that I'm representing education and early childhood development, and so I look forward to being able to discuss this.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers is ended. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader to call business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, please call, address and reply to the speech from the throne.
Address and reply, speech from the throne. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and continue my address to the speech from the throne, Mr. Speaker. It's been interesting reading over the last few days to have an opportunity to truly assess what's been put before this House as really a political document, an election platform. But I think to be fair to the government, there were a few things inside of this document which provides a little bit of